We are placing you directly into the suffocating, incense-heavy air of a wooden church. It's a sweltering summer day.
July 10th, 1086, to be exact.
Right. We are in the city of Odense on the Danish island of Funen. And outside the thick wooden doors of this church, the Albani Church, there is a massive, furious mob just screaming for blood.
And they are armed with, whatever they could carry, spears, axes, heavy farming tools. And they are actively trying to batter their way inside.
Which is terrifying.
It's a scene of absolute raw desperation because the people outside aren't like an invading foreign army.
Yeah.
They are this coalition of starving farmers, furious local nobles, exhausted sailors, and the man they are trying to slaughter is their own ruler, King Knud the Fourth.
And Knud is trapped inside with his brother Benedict and just this small elite guard. He hasn't barricaded the doors right now. He hasn't armed himself for a final glorious Viking stand. Instead, he is lying flat on the stone floor in front of the altar. Yeah. His arms are spread wide. He's deliberately imitating the posture of Christ on the cross, just waiting for the end.
It is arguably one of the most cinematic, defining moments of the 11th century, because what we are witnessing here isn't just the assassination of a controversial monarch. Right. It's the violent, traumatic collision of two entirely different worlds. It's the bloody end of the localized, sword-swinging Viking Age, and it's crashing head-on into the highly organized, bureaucratic, deeply religious machinery of medieval Europe.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a reigning monarch ends up lying spread-eagle on a church floor waiting for a mob to butcher him, we really have to look at the mechanics of state building.
Absolutely.
We're doing a deep dive into the historical and archaeological sources surrounding King Knud, better known to history as Knud the Holy, and our mission today is to kind of act as a guide.
Like for a high school history lesson, right?
Exactly. We want to distill this for a high school history lesson. We want to understand the intense, often brutal centralization attempts he forced upon Denmark, the spectacular failure of those attempts, and, well, the incredible irony of his death.
The irony being that his gruesome murder ultimately accomplished everything he failed to achieve in life.
Yes.
The overarching narrative here is how one king's assassination became the specific catalyst that birthed the modern centralized Danish state.
Which is wild.
It is. The sources allow us to map this transition perfectly, tracing it from an era where a king was just, a warlord with the sharpest sword, to an era where the king was viewed as God's untouchable representative on earth.
So let's wind the clock back slightly to introduce our protagonist.
Yeah.
Knud is the son of King Sven Estridsson.
Yeah.
And to understand the psychological pressure Knud was under, you have to look at the absolutely chaotic family dynamic he was born into.
Oh, it is a mess.
King Sven managed to hold the Danish realm together largely by forming alliances with the Catholic Church, but his succession planning was essentially a recipe for civil war.
Yeah, Sven fathered at least 20 children.
20?
Including 13 sons with various mistresses, so it is a staggeringly unstable situation.
Right, because you have 13 young men, all raised in this hyper-competitive warrior culture, all possessing royal blood, and all of them believing they have a legitimate claim to absolute power.
And the geopolitical reality of the 11th century dictated that the crown wasn't simply inherited by the eldest son. A king had to be elected.
Right. The regional power brokers, the warlords, the wealthy landowners, the bishops, they would gather at regional assemblies known as the Ting.
Yes, the Ting.
And they effectively voted on who got to wear the crown.
Which, as you can imagine, gave the regional nobles immense leverage. They didn't want a strong, centralized ruler who would tax them and dictate laws.
They wanted a manager.
Exactly. They wanted someone who would leave their localized power structures intact. So when Sven died around 1076, Knud was fully confident he would be chosen.
I mean, he was a hardened veteran.
Yeah, he was. He had led Viking raids into England in 1069 and again in 1074, actively challenging William.
Ideal. But the nobles pull a massive upset. They bypass the hardened warrior, and they elect his older brother, Harold III. And the historical nickname the sources give Harold is so incredibly telling.
Oh, it's brilliant.
They called him Harold Hen.
Harold the Whetstone.
A whetstone is a soft stone. You use it to sharpen harder metals. The implication is so obvious. He was soft, pliable, easily manipulated.
He was exactly the kind of weak, hands-off monarch the regional nobles craved.
And this decision infuriates Knud.
Utterly. He refused to accept a subordinate role and immediately went into exile in Sweden. And for years, he sustained himself and his loyal followers by Well, returning to his roots.
Raiding the Baltics.
Raiding the Baltics, heavily targeting Estonia. He was basically biding his time, accumulating wealth and military experience, waiting for the political winds in Denmark to change.
And that change arrives in 1080 when Harald dies. Knud finally secures the election and takes the throne.
But stepping into power in 1080 meant inheriting a fractured nightmare.
Yeah.
If you look at the kingdom Knud was trying to govern, it wasn't really a nation in the modern sense. It was a patchwork of distinct regions, Jutland, Funen, Zealand, Scania, each fiercely independent.
Operating under its own specific customs and laws, the local nobles viewed themselves not as the king's subjects, but as his peers.
Right. So the foundational problem of state building was staring him right in the face. How do you force a fragmented, heavily armed, fiercely independent population to submit to a single, unified authority?
You can't just yell at them.
No. Knud realized very quickly that the old Viking model of ruling through personal charisma and intimidation just wasn't scalable. He didn't want to be a first among equals chieftain.
He's looking south.
Yes, toward the Holy Roman Empire and the broader European continent, and he saw a completely different model of power.
He saw monarchs ruling by the grace of God. Absolute authority, backed by a massive institutional framework.
Precisely. Knud recognized that to centralize power, he needed a bureaucracy, he needed massive streams of revenue that bypassed the local lords, and most importantly, he needed an ideological justification for his absolute rule.
And he found all three of those things in a strategic alliance with the Catholic Church.
He did.
This alliance is documented in what is arguably the most critical piece of source material from this entire era, which is the Deed of Gift from May 21st, 1085.
The Gave-brev.
The Gave-brev, yeah. And for our high school history lesson framing, we really need to emphasize this document. It isn't just a dusty old contract. It is a weapon of mass centralization.
It is a staggering document, and not just because it holds the title of the oldest preserved coherent text of Danish origin.
Right.
On its surface, the 1085 Deed of Gift appears to be an act of extreme royal piety. King Knud officially transfers vast tracts of royal land properties spread across Zealand, Amager, and Scania to the newly established Scania Church in Lund.
Which, giving land to the church was a standard medieval political move. You buy some spiritual goodwill, maybe ensure some prayers for your soul.
Sure.
But when you dive into the specific clauses of the Gave-brev, it becomes clear this wasn't about piety. Knud wasn't just handing over acres of dirt. He was handing over jurisdictional legal authority.
And what's fascinating here is the genius of the document. Knud granted the church the explicit right to collect specific legal fines from the people living on those massive tracts of land.
Right.
Traditionally, the right to collect these fines belonged exclusively to the king or to the local regional assemblies, the ting.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that for a second, because the implications are massive.
Yeah.
If a local noble historically collected fines for disputes in his area, that was his primary source of income.
Exactly.
It's how he maintained his own private retinue of warriors. By suddenly rerouting that money to the church in Lund, Knud is effectively bankrupting his potential political rivals.
He is financially starving the decentralized power structures while simultaneously creating a hyper-wealthy, fiercely loyal institutional ally.
Because the church in Lund suddenly has immense resources, but their legal right to those resources is entirely dependent on the king's authority.
Right. If the local lords rebel and overthrow Knud, the church loses its new income. The alliance perfectly fuses the survival of the crown with the financial interests of the church.
And to really understand how Knud engineered this, the sources provide us with a fascinating vocabulary of 11th century statecraft. The transition from a Viking warlord society to a taxed bureaucratic state required entirely new administrative concepts.
It really did.
So I want to run through these terms and translate them for the classroom. First up, the texts frequently reference the concept of a bowl, B-O-L. What exactly is a bowl?
The bowl is a crucial concept to grasp. It represents a fundamental shift in how the state viewed its territory. A bowl wasn't a standard geographical measurement like, an acre or a hectare. It was a measurement of agricultural production capacity and value. It was designed to answer one specific question. How much wealth can this specific piece of land generate?
So it's effectively creating the medieval equivalent of property zoning and a national tax assessment database.
That's a perfect analogy.
You cannot systematically extract wealth from a population if you don't have a reliable, standardized record of what everyone owns and what it produces. Knud was actively trying to map the economic lifeblood of his entire kingdom so he could tax it efficiently.
And to enforce that taxation, he needed to restructure the justice system. Which brings us to another key term in the centralization process. The Herde.
The Herde.
Yeah. Before this era, justice was largely localized. If there was a dispute, it was settled at a local assembly, often heavily influenced by whoever happened to be the wealthiest or most violent warlord in the immediate vicinity.
It was essentially vigilante justice mixed with local politics.
Pretty much.
But establishing a Herde completely upended that. A Herde was a designated formal administrative and judicial district.
Right. By drawing a boundary and calling it a Herde, Knud is establishing a territorial court system that superseded local warlords.
Wow.
He was declaring that justice in this specific area didn't emanate from the local strongman, it emanated from the crown. The officials presiding over the Herde reported up the chain to the king's centralized legal framework.
It's the medieval equivalent of the federal government moving into a frontier territory, overriding the local town sheriff, and setting up federal court districts. It systematically strips judicial autonomy away from the region.
Yeah, exactly.
And once you control the courts, you control the fines, which ties directly back to the 1085 deed of gift and another concept we need to define, Fredkub.
Ah, Fredkub. It literally translates to buying peace.
Buying peace.
In the Norse legal tradition, if you committed a severe crime, murder, grand theft, you could be declared an outlaw.
Which was bad.
Terrifying. It meant you were literally placed outside the protection of the law. Anyone could kill you without facing legal consequences. You were dead to society.
But the system had a built-in loophole.
It did. If you had enough wealth, you could pay a massive fine to the authorities to have your outlaw status lifted. You could purchase your way back into society.
It was a medieval get-out-of-jail-free card, but the price tag was astronomical.
And who received that massive payout? Under the old system, it often went to the local assembly or the regional lords.
Right.
But under Knud's new framework, specifically in the areas covered by the Bead of Gift, the right to collect the Fredkub was granted to his allies in the church. He monetized the justice system, and he used that monopoly on violence and forgiveness to fund his centralization efforts.
Okay, but taking power and money away from well-armed Viking lords creates an incredibly dangerous blowback. If you bankrupt the regional warlords, they are going to come for you.
Oh, absolutely.
Knud knew he couldn't rely on the traditional decentralized levies of warriors provided by those very lords. He needed a standing professional security apparatus. And the sources referred to the leaders of this new force as Staller.
A Staller wasn't just a loyal drinking buddy or like a temporary wartime commander. This was a formal, high-ranking, institutionalized position within the king's permanent retinue, his Herde.
A professionalized secret service, essentially. A centralized military command structure composed of men whose loyalty was bought and paid for directly by the crown, rather than men who just showed up for the promise of plunder.
Yes. He was building the machinery of a modern state, a tax database through the bowl, a federalized court system through the Herde, the monetization of justice through Fredkub, and a professional military apparatus led by the Staller.
But the machinery of a state is incredibly expensive to run.
Extremely expensive.
Which brings us to the taxes. Because taking the fines away from the nobles wasn't enough. Knud went after the general population. He attempted to enforce a nationwide mandatory 10% tax tithe on all agricultural production.
Every 10th sheaf of wheat, every 10th pig had to be handed over to the church.
This was a radical shock to the system. The Danish farming population was fiercely proud of their status as free men. They were accustomed to providing resources during times of war, but the concept of a permanent, recurring 10% drain on their livelihood.
They viewed it as an existential threat and a deep violation of their ancient rights.
And as if a 10% tithe wasn't enough to push a subsistence farming population to the brink, Knud also introduced a poll tax, the Limfjorden.
Literally translated, it means nose tax or head tax. It was a flat tax levied on every single individual, regardless of their wealth or social standing.
Why?
For a wealthy merchant, it was an annoyance. For a struggling farmer barely surviving a long winter, it was devastating.
So we have a societal powder keg. The nobility is furious because they've been stripped of their judicial power and their revenue streams. The general population is furious because they are being crushed under unprecedented European-style taxation. The entire country is vibrating with resentment.
Yeah.
And what does King Knud decide to do at this exact volatile moment?
He decides to launch one of the most ambitious and logistically terrifying military operations in Northern European history.
It is a catastrophic misreading of the room. The transition from bureaucratic overreach to outright military disaster is breathtaking. Knud's fatal flaw wasn't just domestic tyranny, it was imperial ambition.
Right. He wasn't satisfied with ruling a centralized Denmark.
He looked back at his predecessor, Knud the Great, who had ruled a massive North Sea empire. Knud wanted that back. Specifically, he wanted to reconquer England.
William the Conqueror had taken England in 1066. Knud, who had raided there in his youth, felt he had a legitimate claim to the English throne. He believed that with a sufficiently massive force, he could cross the North Sea and tear England away from the Normans.
The scale of what he demanded in 1085 is almost hard to comprehend. Knud issued the royal order for the entire naval fleet of the realm to gather in the Limfjorden.
A massive body of water in northern Jutland.
And the sources, while perhaps prone to slight exaggeration, estimate that up to 1,000 ships answered this call.
Even if we account for medieval hyperbole, the visual reality of that gathering would have been staggering. The Limfjord would have been choked with timber and sailcloth, and the archaeological record backs up the sheer scale of the engineering involved. Consider the discovery known as Wreck 6.
I find Wreck 6 fascinating, because when we picture a Viking ship, we often think of something relatively small and sleek. But Wreck 6 was a monster.
It was a long ship measuring over 37 meters in length. It was designed to carry a crew of roughly 100 men. It wasn't built for trading or exploring. It was a dedicated, state-of-the-art war machine.
That's huge.
Now extrapolate that. Imagine hundreds of vessels of varying sizes, carrying thousands upon thousands of armed men, crowding into the fjords. Knud had even leveraged his international alliances, securing support ships from his father-in-law, Robert I of Flanders, and King Olaf Kjær of Norway.
But building and maintaining a fleet that size requires immense immediate manpower. The ships don't row themselves. And this introduces a concept that is absolutely central to understanding the catastrophe that follows, the system of leading. L-E-D-I-N-G.
The leading was the very lifeblood of the Old Norse military structure. It was the system of mandatory naval conscription.
Right.
It wasn't a standing navy of paid sailors. It was a strict, inescapable legal obligation placed directly upon the farming population.
Let's break down the mechanics of the leading because it really highlights the vulnerability of the whole society. The kingdom was divided into specific naval districts. When the king declared a leading, each district was legally required to provide a fully constructed ship.
But it didn't stop there.
No. The community had to supply the men to row it, the weapons to fight with, and crucially, the food to sustain the crew for the duration of the campaign.
It was a massive, localized logistical burden. If you were a free farmer in 11th century Denmark, a call to leading meant you had to drop your tools, abandon your fields, pack up months of dried fish and grain from your own personal stores, and march to the coast.
You were effectively funding and fighting the king's war out of your own pocket. And timing was everything. In an agrarian society, the calendar is a matter of life and death. The fleet was ordered to gather in the summer of 1085. The farmers arrive. They load their supplies. They sit in the sweltering heat of the Limfjord, surrounded by tens of thousands of other men, creating a massive, localized sanitation and logistical nightmare.
Oh, the smell must have been unbelievable.
And they're waiting for the king to arrive so they can cross the North Sea. But the king doesn't show up.
Knud is entirely absent. The days turn into weeks. The weeks drag on toward the late summer, and the situation in the Limfjord transitions from an organized military gathering into a desperate survival scenario.
Wait, where is he? You don't order 1,000 ships and tens of thousands of men to gather and then simply forget about them.
Knud was trapped at the absolute opposite end of the country, at the southern border down in Schleswig. He was locked in a highly tense geopolitical standoff with the German Emperor Henry IV.
Okay, we have to look at the broader European context here. Henry IV was in the middle of a massive power struggle with the papacy, the investiture controversy.
Right.
And Knud had explicitly allied himself with the Pope to legitimize his rule. So by aligning with the Pope and with Flanders, Knud had made himself a geopolitical target for the German emperor.
Exactly. Knud received intelligence that Henry might be preparing an invasion of Denmark's southern border. Knud found himself paralyzed.
He couldn't leave.
Right. If he sailed the bulk of his military forces across the North Sea to invade England, he would leave the southern door wide open for a German invasion. He felt he couldn't leave Schleswig until the German threat was neutralized.
Wait, if he's ruling by the grace of God, why couldn't he just command them to stay? Weren't they bound by duty?
The lack of communication or the sheer disregard for the realities of his own army is staggering. A modern general might be able to keep troops in a holding pattern for months. But the men in the Limfjord weren't professional soldiers receiving a salary and army rations.
They were subsistence farmers.
And they were eating through the very supplies they had brought for the invasion. But more critically, they were watching the sun. As late summer approached, a wave of absolute panic would have swept through that fleet. They knew exactly when the harvest had to be brought in.
It's pure biological math. If they sit in the boats for another 2 weeks, the crops back home rot in the fields. If the crops rot, there is no food stored for the winter.
And if there is no food stored for the winter, their wives and children literally starve to death.
It's the ultimate breaking point of medieval loyalty. The abstract legal obligation of the leading simply dissolved in the face of impending starvation.
The men weren't mutinying out of a desire for political upheaval. They were mutinying out of absolute biological necessity. They had to go home to cut the wheat, or their families would die.
I imagine the atmosphere in that fleet was incredibly volatile. You have tens of thousands of armed men who are already furious about the poll taxes, furious about the new tithes, and now they are terrified of starving. And into this powder keg steps Knud's own half-brother, Olaf.
Oluf was present with the fleet in the Limfjorden, and seeing the desperation of the farmers, he made a calculated political decision.
He sided with them.
He publicly sided with them, he validated their grievances, and essentially gave royal sanction to their desire to abandon the leading and return to their farms.
It's massive betrayal from Knud's perspective, but brilliant political opportunism from Olaf. He instantly becomes the champion of the common man. How does Knud react when news reaches him in Schleswig that his brother is letting a mutiny?
With absolute uncompromising ruthlessness, Knud managed to have Olaf arrested for treason. He didn't execute him, perhaps fearing the optics of fratricide, but he stripped him of all power, clapped him in chains, and shipped him entirely out of the country.
Where did he send him?
Sending him to Flanders to be imprisoned by Knud's father-in-law, Robert.
But removing the figurehead doesn't remove the underlying crisis. Olaf is in chains, but the crops are still rotting. And when Knud finally believes the southern border is secure and travels north to the Limfjord late in the summer, he arrives to find a ghost town.
Completely deserted.
A massive portion of the fleet had simply dissolved. The farmers had packed up their remaining meager supplies and gone home to try and salvage the harvest.
For Knud, this was an unforgivable affront. He was trying to build an absolute monarchy ruling by divine mandate. To have his direct military orders ignored was a challenge to his very legitimacy. He didn't view it as a tragic logistical failure. He viewed it as mass treason.
And instead of offering a royal pardon or acknowledging that he had kept them waiting too long, he decides to punish them. He invokes the law of Ledingsbred.
Ledingsbred is the legal term for breaking the obligation of the naval draft. It carried devastating financial penalties. Knud dispatched his officials across the countryside, demanding massive fines from every single man who had abandoned the fleet early.
It is an act of sheer political suicide. Think about the compounding pressure on these people. They are already suffocating under the 10% agricultural tithe. They're already being squeezed by the Nefstjeld poll tax. They just lost weeks of vital agricultural labor sitting uselessly in a fjord. They are staring down a harsh winter with diminished crop yields. And now the king's men ride into their villages demanding crippling fines for the crime of trying to save their own families from starving.
It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The resentment wasn't just localized anymore, it was universal. The entire agrarian base of the kingdom recognized that Knud's relentless drive for centralization and wealth extraction was going to destroy them. The rebellion didn't just simmer, it exploded.
It starts right there in northern Jutland. In a region called Vendsyssel, the population simply snaps. The royal officials trying to collect the fines are attacked. The localized violence rapidly coalesces into an organized, furious uprising.
And the narrative immediately shifts from a slow-burn political history into an incredibly fast-paced, high-stakes thriller. Because King Knud is suddenly no longer the absolute monarch dictating terms, he is the prey.
The speed of the collapse is staggering. Knud's authority vanished overnight. He was staying at his royal estate in Berglum, a symbol of royal power in the north. The estate rapidly fell to the advancing mob. Knud and his loyal herd, his professional retinue, were forced to flee for their lives.
The sources allow us to map this frantic, desperate escape route in July of 1086. It's a map of a kingdom rapidly rejecting its king. He flees south from Berglum toward Agersborg,
Which was historically a massive Viking ring fortress, right? A stronghold.
Yes, but he finds no safety there. He has entirely lost control of the Limfjord, meaning his naval highways are cut off. He is forced to retreat further south, deep into the Jutland mainland, arriving at the city of Viborg.
Viborg is a crucial location. It was the ancient seat of the regional assembly for Jutland. Here we see a final, desperate attempt to de-escalate the situation. The local religious authority, Bishop Henrik, attempts to step in as a mediator.
He goes out to face the massive armed mob that has tracked the king to the city.
The bishop tries to use the moral weight of the church to calm the waters. He likely appeals to their sense of Christian duty or, tries to negotiate a reduction in the fines.
But the attempt completely fails. It demonstrates how deeply the social contract had broken down. The mob is past the point of negotiation or religious obedience.
They don't care.
They don't care about the bishop's authority. Their economic ruin is imminent, and their rage against the king is absolute. The bishop is forced to retreat, and Knud realizes that the entire mainland of Jutland is a death trap.
He has to keep running. His initial plan seems to have been to flee south, cross the border into Schleswig, and perhaps seek asylum in the Holy Roman Empire.
But the geopolitics come back to haunt him. The border is heavily militarized due to his ongoing tensions with Emperor Henry IV. He fears he might be captured or killed by the Germans if he crosses over.
Out of options on the mainland, he makes a fateful decision. He pivots east. He crosses the water, the Little Belt, and lands on the island of Funen.
But the pursuit is relentless. The mob isn't just letting him leave. They are actively hunting him across the water. And there is a deeply poignant, incredibly specific local detail recorded in the oral traditions and later sources regarding his flight across Funen.
Yeah, as he is fleeing, exhausted, hunted like an animal, he is forced to rest in a field.
Tradition holds that he collapsed against a large boulder at Assenboll Mark to catch his breath. Today, centuries later, that specific stone is still locally known as St. Knud's stone.
Wow.
It is a visceral, physical marker of how far the mighty had fallen. The king who wanted to rule an empire reduced to gasping for air against a rock in a farmer's field.
He pushes on and finally reaches the major city of Odense. The very name of the city is soaked in the old ways it derives from Odense Vig, meaning Odin's sanctuary. It was an ancient center of pagan power that had transitioned into a major Christian hub.
Right.
Knud is exhausted, his retinue is small, and the mob is closing in. He needs an impregnable fortress. But instead of a castle, he chooses a wooden building. He seeks sanctuary in the Albani Church.
It wasn't a random choice, though. Knud had previously secured the holy relics of an English martyr, St. Alban, and brought them to this specific church. By crossing the threshold of St. Albani, Knud was invoking the absolute highest law of the medieval world, the law of holy asylum.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is a concept that is hard for a modern, secular mind to fully grasp. Holy asylum wasn't just a polite tradition. It was an absolute, unbreakable, terrified taboo.
The belief was literal. The interior of a consecrated church was God's physical domain on earth. If you spilled blood inside that space, you weren't just committing a crime against a man, you were committing a direct, violent assault against God himself.
You were condemning your own eternal soul to damnation.
By lying in front of the altar with the relics, Knud was betting his life that the fear of hell would override the mob's desire for vengeance. If you are inside the church touching the altar, you are legally and spiritually untouchable by the laws of men.
The mob surrounds the wooden church. And the psychology of that moment is incredibly dark. You have hundreds, maybe thousands of men outside. They're staring at the wooden doors. They know the king is inside.
Yeah.
They know that if they let him live, he will eventually raise an army, hunt them down, and execute every single one of them for treason.
The immediate physical terror of the king's retribution begins to outweigh the abstract spiritual terror of breaking the sanctuary taboo. When a population is pushed to the absolute extreme of starvation and political desperation, the invisible boundaries of religious law start to disintegrate.
We have a staggeringly detailed account of the assassination itself. It comes from an English monk named Elnoth, who lived in Denmark and wrote his chronicle roughly 35 years after the event. He interviewed people who were alive at the time.
Right.
How does Elnoth describe the atmosphere inside the church on that July day in 1086?
Elnoth crafts an incredibly cinematic, highly symbolic narrative. He paints a picture of a king who recognizes that his earthly power has completely evaporated and who consciously decides to pivot to a spiritual victory. Okay.
According to Elnoth, Knud makes no attempt to barricade the heavy wooden doors. He doesn't draw a sword to go down fighting.
He prepares his soul. The chronicle details that he formally confessed his sins to the priests present. He received the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, And then he lowered himself to the stone floor directly in front of the high altar.
And Elnoth makes a point to describe his exact physical posture. Knud lays flat on his back, spreading his arms wide in the shape of a cross. He is physically, consciously imitating the crucifixion of Christ. He is presenting himself not as an embattled politician, but as a willing, holy martyr awaiting the strike. The tension outside boils over. The mob doesn't initially batter the doors down. Perhaps the taboo is still causing some hesitation, but the violence finds a way. Elnoth records that the death blow came from outside the building.
A weapon, Elnoth suggests it was a spear, or perhaps a heavy arrow was thrust or fired blindly through one of the church windows. It struck the prostrate king directly in the side, deeply piercing his torso.
The symbolism is almost too perfect, mirroring the Roman soldier's spear piercing the side of Christ on the cross. Once the king is struck and begins to bleed out on the altar, the psychological dam breaks. The taboo is shattered.
The mob realizes there is no going back. They smash their way through the doors and pour into the sanctuary.
What follows is an absolute bloodbath. It isn't just an assassination, it's a massacre. They butcher the dying king, but they don't stop there. They turn on anyone who stands with him. Knud's brother, Benedict, who refused to leave his side, is hacked to death in the nave.
And crucially, the elite professional guards, the herdmen, are slaughtered. These were men who had sworn an oath of absolute loyalty to the king. In an era where loyalty was often bought and sold, these men held the line. They fought and died in a confined space against overwhelming odds.
The historical sources actually preserve the names of 17 of these loyal men on a document known as the Tabula Atheniensis. The names ring out from history: Asmund, Black, Sven, Paunay. They were the king's enforcers, and they shared his brutal fate on the church floor.
Out of the entire royal retinue trapped inside the central Albani Church, only one single man miraculously manages to survive the chaos and escape the city. Another of Knud's half-brothers, a man named Eric, who would later be known to history as Eric Ejegod.
Keep that name firmly in your mind, because Eric's survival is the pivot point upon which the entire future of Denmark turns.
In the immediate aftermath, the mob is victorious, the king is dead, the hated taxes are effectively dissolved, the agonizing naval drafts are over, the rebels immediately send for Olaf, the brother Knud had imprisoned in Flanders, and bring him back. They crown him King Olaf.
So from a purely political standpoint, the crisis is resolved, the tyrant is gone, the popular brother is in charge, and the farmers can finally return to their fields in peace.
If the story ended there, Knud would just be a footnote, a harsh king who pushed his people too far and paid the price. But history rarely follows a clean narrative arc. What actually happens next is one of the darkest, most traumatic, and utterly bizarre periods in the medieval chronicles. The reign of King Olaf, from 1086 to 1095, is defined by an absolute, relentless environmental catastrophe.
The country is hit by a series of devastating consecutive crop failures. The very farmers who mutinied and murdered their king because they were terrified of missing a single harvest suddenly find themselves facing years of rotting fields, endless rain, and empty storehouses. Extreme famine sweeps across the Danish realm. People are reduced to eating bark and boiling leather.
To understand the political fallout of this famine, we have to look through the lens of the 11th century mindset. They didn't have meteorologists. They didn't understand global climate shifts or El Niño patterns. They lived in a fundamentally religious universe where every single natural event was a direct communication from God.
If it rains, God is pleased. If the crops fail, God is furiously angry. And the Catholic Church, deeply allied with the murdered king and furious about the violation of their holy sanctuary, recognizes an unprecedented propaganda opportunity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the spin is absolutely brilliant and entirely ruthless. Every Sunday, from pulpits across the country, the surviving loyalists and the clergy deliver a terrifying message. They look at the starving congregation and they say, "Why is the sky raining rot? Why are your children starving? Because you walked into God's holy house and murdered his anointed representative on earth."
This famine isn't weather, it is divine retribution. It's like the ultimate political PR campaign. But instead of using social media, they are using starvation and weather as proof that the opposing political party is cursed by God.
It is a masterclass in psychological warfare. They take a natural climate anomaly and weaponize it to completely flip the historical narrative. The harsh, authoritarian centralizer who squeezed his people dry is suddenly reframed as a pious, holy martyr.
And the people who rebelled for their own survival are branded as cursed, unholy murderers bearing the collective guilt of a nation.
The propaganda campaign was so total and so effective that the new king couldn't escape it. He wasn't remembered as King Olaf the Liberator. The church branded him with a nickname that would haunt him for eternity. He went down in the historical record as Olaf Hunger.
Olaf Hunger. He became the ultimate scapegoat. He inherited an impossible situation. He actually attempted to dismantle Knud's oppressive taxation to help the people. But because his reign coincided with an environmental disaster, he absorbed all the blame.
The trauma of this famine cut so deeply into the national psyche that Olaf's eventual death in 1095 is shrouded in incredibly dark, persistent rumors.
The chronicles are vague, but modern historians have actively debated a theory regarding Olaf's end, a concept known as a konjaffer, a king sacrifice.
The theory posits that the desperation was so profound, the belief in the divine curse so absolute, that Olaf either took his own life or was ritually murdered by the nobility.
The idea was that a literal blood sacrifice of the ruling monarch was the only way to appease God's wrath and lift the famine.
Whether this is literal historical fact or just a dark rumor cultivated by his enemies, the mere existence of the theory illustrates how completely the narrative had turned. Olaf was broken by the legacy of the brother he replaced.
So Olaf Hunger dies under a cloud of misery in 1095. The country is traumatized, impoverished, and desperate for stability. And who steps out of the shadows to claim the throne? Erik Ejegod.
The one man who survived the massacre in the Odense church 9 years earlier.
Erik is a fascinating figure. He takes the throne and surveys the political landscape. He sees how effectively the church utilized Knud's memory to explain the famine. He realizes the sheer, unassailable power of a martyrdom narrative. And he decides that it isn't enough to just have people feel guilty about the murder. He needs to institutionalize that guilt.
Which brings us to the absolute turning point of this entire historical saga. Erik Ejegod decides to spearhead the creation of a national saint cult. Having a murdered brother is a political liability, but having a recognized, canonized saint for a brother, that is the ultimate political weapon.
But the mechanics of sainthood are complex. You can't just decree it. You need proof of divine favor. Very conveniently, shortly after Knud's burial in Odense, reports began circulating that extraordinary things were happening near his grave.
The classic hallmarks of medieval hagiography. Rumors spread that the blind were suddenly regaining their sight after visiting the tomb. People with chronic illnesses were supposedly miraculously healed just by being near his remains.
Erik and the church hierarchy actively amplified these miracle reports. They meticulously documented them. And in 1098, Erik Ejegod makes an incredibly arduous, highly strategic journey. He travels all the way across Europe to Rome to secure a personal audience with Pope Urban II.
We need to contextualize the geopolitical brilliance of this trip. 1098 is right in the middle of the First Crusade. Pope Urban II is actively trying to assert the absolute supremacy of the papacy over secular kings across Europe. And here comes Erik of Denmark presenting the perfect story.
Erik pitches his brother's case. He presents the violent martyrdom in the sanctuary. He presents the documented miracles. And crucially, he frames Knud's death as the ultimate sacrifice made in defense of the church's right to collect tithes.
He completely glosses over the fact that Knud was widely hated and murdered by his own subjects for tyrannical overreach.
It's the perfect political transaction. Pope Urban gets a shining example of a monarch who died fighting for papal rights, a great propaganda tool for his own struggles against the German emperor. And Erik gets the ultimate validation. In 1100, the Vatican officially canonizes King Knud. He becomes Canute the Holy, Denmark's first ever papal recognized saint.
The culmination of this process is a spectacular display of power. On April 19, 1100, Knud's bones are exhumed. They are placed in a magnificent, glittering golden shrine and elevated upon the high altar of the newly constructed Odense Cathedral, specifically named St. Knudskirk in his honor.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom out and look at the macro level, we have to ask the core question for the students. Why does this matter? Why is this specific sequence of events considered the definitive turning point in the history of the Danish state?
Because of the profound, permanent ideological shift it cemented. In life, Knud failed completely. His attempts to centralize power through taxes and force resulted in a spectacular collapse. But in death, by being elevated to a saint, he provided the Danish monarchy with something far more powerful than a sword or a tax registry. He provided absolute, unassailable, divine legitimacy.
It's the institutionalization of the divine right of kings. Before the canonization of Knud, a king was ultimately accountable to the warlords who elected him. If a king overstepped, the people had the right to violently depose him, which is exactly what they did to Knud.
But once the church placed a golden halo over his head, the rules of the game changed permanently. The monarchy and the church fused their authority into a single, terrifying block. Rebelling against the sitting king was no longer framed as a dangerous but acceptable political maneuver. It was now framed as a mortal sin.
To challenge the king was to challenge the bloodline of a saint who sat at the right hand of God.
Knud achieved everything he ever wanted. The absolute centralization of authority, the subjugation of the regional nobles, the European-style monarchy solely through the act of dying. The brutal, localized Viking era was officially buried in that crypt in Odense, and the European medieval state was born.
And what makes this deep dive so compelling is that we don't have to rely entirely on 900-year-old chronicles written by biased monks. We have hard, physical, archaeological evidence that bridges the gap between myth and reality. You can physically walk into the crypt of Odense Cathedral today and look at the truth.
Yes, the shrines containing the skeletons of King Knud and his brother Benedict are still there, visible behind glass. And modern osteological analysis, the forensic examination of the bones, has provided an incredible confirmation of the dramatic narrative laid out by the monk Elnoth.
Let's look at the specific bone damage. When anthropologists examine Knud's skeleton, they focus closely on the korsband,
the sacrum, the large, heavy, triangular bone located at the very base of the spine, right between the hip bones.
Exactly. The skeletal analysis confirms the remains belong to a strongly built man in his roughly late 30s or early 40s. But more importantly, the sacrum exhibits distinct, undeniable perimortem weapon damage. There is a deep, penetrating lesion on the bone.
A lesion that perfectly aligns with a heavy thrusting weapon like a spear or a lance striking the victim violently in the lower side or abdomen. It is a stunning forensic validation of a 900-year-old text. The hunk said he lay on the floor and was speared through the window in his side, and the bones say, yes, that is exactly how this man died.
It is a remarkable intersection of history and science. But the bones aren't the only artifacts preserved in those shrines. When the monks enshrined Knud in 1100, they didn't just place his bare bones in a box, they wrapped them in textiles. And the textiles that survived are some of the most valuable, revealing artifacts of the early medieval period in all of Europe.
We have to talk about the artepe, the eagle silk. This isn't coarse, locally woven wool. It is a massive piece of shockingly luxurious, deep purple silk, intricately woven with massive, stylized eagle motifs.
And eagles in the 11th century, particularly on purple silk, carry a very specific, undeniable meaning. They are the ultimate, exclusive symbol of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. They represent supreme imperial dignity and divine absolute power. This silk was manufactured thousands of miles away in the most sophisticated workshops on the planet.
There's also a secondary textile, a bright yellow silk pillow woven with images of peacocks. In early Christian iconography, the peacock is a powerful symbol of resurrection and eternal life because they believed the flesh of a peacock never decayed.
Historians strongly believe these incredibly rare silks were sent to Odense by Knud's widow, Queen Adel. After her husband's murder, she fled south, eventually settling in southern Italy. The fact that she could procure Byzantine imperial silks and have them shipped back to Denmark for a shrine is vital for our understanding of the era.
It completely shatters the popular misconception that 11th century Denmark was just an isolated, muddy outpost of uncultured barbarians. It proves that the Danish royal house was intimately plugged into vast, incredibly wealthy international networks of trade, diplomacy, and royal intermarriage that stretched from the freezing waters of the Limfjorden all the way across Europe to the Mediterranean Sea and the gates of Constantinople.
The legacy of Knud is so complex that every subsequent generation has had to redefine him to fit their own narrative. We can trace this evolution through visual art over the centuries. Start with his own royal seal from the 1085 Deed of Gift. It perfectly captures his dual nature. One side depicts a pious, European-style king seated on a throne holding an orb.
The other side depicts a traditional Viking warrior on horseback, hunting with a falcon.
He was trying to be both, and the contradiction tore his kingdom apart. If you jump forward to the 17th century, the era of absolute monarchy, engravers like Albert Halve depicted Knud with serene Baroque majesty. They presented a calm, divine ruler, completely ignoring the violent, chaotic reality of his actual reign and death. They used his image to justify their own absolute power.
Then you move into the 19th century Romantic era, and painters like Christian Albrecht von Benzon swing the pendulum the other way. Benzon painted a massive, highly emotional, melodramatic canvas of the assassination in the church. It was full of deep shadows, pious suffering, and tragic heroism.
And even today, modern Danish artists like Thomas Knud tackle the subject. Knud paints hyper-realistic, almost unsettling, confrontational portraits of Knud. It's as if every era uses King Knud as a mirror, projecting their own understandings of faith, the state's monopoly on violence, and national identity onto his bones.
He is the ultimate historical Rorschach test. A tyrant to the farmers who starved under his naval drafts, a martyr to the church that profited from his laws, and the foundational pillar of the centralized state that followed.
We have traced an incredible violent arc today. We started with a king whose ambition outstripped his reality, a man who dreamed of a centralized, taxed, bureaucratic European empire, but whose aggressive methods, the bull registries, the tithes, the Limfjorden, and the disastrous leading draft in the Limfjorden, alienated a fiercely independent population.
Which sparked a desperate rebellion among men facing the very real terror of starvation. That rebellion triggered a frantic chase across the countryside, culminating in the shattering of the ultimate religious taboo, the slaughter of an anointed king inside a holy sanctuary.
Yet, through the crucible of a devastating famine, the church and his successors engineered a brilliant psychological campaign. They elevated the hated tyrant into a national saint, permanently cementing the divine right of kings, and effectively achieving the centralization of power that Knud had died trying to enforce.
It is a profound lesson in statecraft. It shows that the narrative of history isn't always written by the victors of a single battle or the leaders of a rebellion. Ultimately, the narrative is forged by the institutions that control the legacy and the interpretation of the dead.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering thread to pull on. A question that reframes the entire narrative we've just explored. I want you to think back to the blood-soaked floor of the scandaled Albani Church in Odense. Think about the one man who miraculously managed to slip through the chaos and escape the massacre.
The king's half-brother, Erik Ejegod, the single survivor out of dozens of highly trained warriors.
Erik is the one who escaped the spears of the mob. Erik is the one who waited patiently while Olaf Hunger took the blame for the famine. Erik is the one who eventually took the throne. Erik is the one who organized the collection of miracle stories. Erik is the one who traveled thousands of miles to Rome to personally pitch the sainthood to Pope Urban II.
And Erik is the one who ultimately reaped the massive, unprecedented political benefits of having a canonized saintly brother to legitimize his own absolute rule.
The timeline of his actions raises an incredibly dark, deeply cynical question about medieval politics.
Was Erik Ejegod simply a traumatized, devoted, deeply pious brother trying to honor the memory of a fallen martyr? Or was he the most brilliant, ruthless political operator of the 11th century?
Did he recognize that the greatest obstacle to centralization wasn't the nobility, but the abrasive personality of Knud himself? Did Erik realize that a dead, silent saint resting safely in a golden box on an altar was infinitely more useful and much easier to govern with than a living, breathing, authoritarian king making disastrous decisions? It's a 900-year-old cold case that challenges everything we know about the birth of a nation, and it is entirely up to you to decide who is truly pulling the strings.